Hello and welcome back to Tenacious Falls, as always brought to you by Tenacious and myself, Coach Dave Cripps, and of course
Coach Dave Craig. Doesn't make any sense. You've got to leave that in there.
Yeah, if there are any of you watch this on YouTube, you'll see as I swung my hand over to him to say his name, he was halfway through swigging his coffee, and that clearly threw it off. That is definitely staying on him. Oh my God. Right, oh God, the only way is up from there, really, isn't it? Oh, crikey. Yes, today's episode, just to give you a bit of an introduction again of why on earth you should give up some of your valuable time to bother listening to us. Where is the value? Part 2 of the Richard Blagrove interview. This one, obviously, is on strength training to improve your running performance as a triathlete. This part of the interview is more to do with the practical side of it. So you've understood the benefits and the science behind it, so you can connect the dots. Now it's about, okay, what are the smart ways we can go about actually doing this? But before that, I just wanted to mention brilliant the interest and excitement from people who've been reaching out to, who are being interviewed and are on our list of being interviewed, whether it's coaches, scientists, researchers, triathletes. I've been really impressed. So hopefully as well for you guys. I know we like to keep things on ice a little bit, but there's some really first class interviews to be coming out to look forward to going ahead. And as always, if you guys have got questions as listeners, or maybe people that you might like to see on here, please get in contact. The more feedback we have, the better we can make this to you guys, the people who hopefully like listening to us. Yeah. But on a less serious note, you're training at the moment, Craig.
Yes.
Or anything of interest been going on with your kind of training?
I've recently ventured back into the swimming pool.
Lovely.
Which then caused me to purchase a lovely, sexy new pair of jammers.
Oh, what size have you gone for?
I've gone for some hoop ones.
Other brands are available.
Yes, and hopefully that will make me feel more streamlined through the water, which I definitely need.
That sounded like the most blatant hoop plug.
Oh,
the tagline of more streamlined through the water.
It should be supporting us then.
Yeah, if they do want to get in touch, please feel free to contact us. Craig is, I'd say, a merchandise man. Also, when it comes to GPS watches.
Yes, I do like my Garmin's. Yeah.
Yeah, we often joke that we think Craig's got his own discount voucher, Craig 10. You could try and use it on the Garmin website. I don't know if it'll work.
Let me know if you have any success.
What about myself in my training? As I've been talking about, I think everything's been about subtly increasing the time I'm training and the volume. Now, obviously, that makes sense for reasons I've spoke about before, because building into Ironman distances, starting off nice and early, so it's not a big jump. But also, there's one of the other sneaky things, and those of you who are married, the other benefit is it makes it less obvious to your other half as the amount of time you're spending training and not doing the dishes, looking after the kids and stuff like that. So a good bit of value there, hopefully, for triathletes who are in long-term relationships and marriage. Wow.
So, I don't have that problem, so it's fine.
No, and I'm hoping, Claire, if you are listening, or anyone who knows Claire, please don't share this. So, yeah, that's a bit from me and Craig, I suppose. But look, today we want to get really stuck in to the interview itself. So, again, Rich, really, if you haven't listened to the first interview that we did as part one of this, really do, because it sets the tone. And honestly, this guy is the world's leading researcher in how strength training makes you a better long distance runner. If you're going to listen to anybody on this type of topic, he's one of the main men. So enjoy it, and we'll speak to you soon. And you obviously mentioned, just as part of the research question, how you've kind of been looking into strength, economy, movement. One of the, as you all know, we can go slightly broader into kind of running technique, I suppose, a little bit. One of the areas of debate is, just so people understand the concept of self-optimization. So essentially, can we train how we run? And if we try to, does it actually improve performance, or is it just something that essentially is almost a subconscious thing that just adapts based on how our fitness and our strength improve? Where do you sit on that continuum, on that argument? Because yeah, I like this one. This is an interesting one. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. This is a really interesting area, and yeah, I mean, if I've got to be honest as well, it's not my main area of research, and this kind of falls within the kind of biomechanics realm a little bit more, I guess. But I've definitely got an opinion on it, like you said, and I think it's important that coaches, and particularly strength and conditioning coaches, have got some understanding of it.
So what would you say then? Fire away.
So yeah, I think with most runners, they obviously do self-optimize, because that's partly based on, well, multitude of different factors, but like their anthropometrics, so their height and their leg lengths and so on, their body mass to some extent, um, potentially their sporting background to some extent. Like if they've been involved with game sports and they've sprinted around a lot, they'll tend to adopt a certain style compared to if they've only ever done distance running. The types of shoes that they've been wearing and the terrains that they've run over. So they'll self-optimize to some extent within that. I mean, my own personal philosophy, and this is, I guess, reflected in the book chapter that was written as part of a book that I edited quite recently, is that if you've got distance runners that are improving, so they're kind of hitting their goals and they're nudging their performance forward over time, and they're not getting injured regularly, so they're remaining fairly injury free, like I would generally leave it alone, because they're healthy, they're improving. And if somebody looks at them and go, oh, you run like not quite right, like it looks a bit ugly, I'm going to start messing around with it. Like there's not very much evidence that it's going to reduce injury risk further, and it's going to necessarily improve economy and performance. So I'd kind of leave it alone with those runners that are doing all right, I guess. The occasions when I would probably look to try and change something is if runners are getting very persistent injuries, particularly the same types of injuries. There may be a subtle change in gait or an aspect of technique is potentially one area that you might want to look at. And you'll probably want to do this in collaboration with ideally a running biomechanist and possibly a physiotherapist as well. So just to give you a couple of examples, if you've got a runner that's got a very aggressive heel strike and their foot's landing a long way in front of their center of mass, like that type of aspect of technique tends to be associated with a lot of knee type injuries. So if they've got persistent patellofemoral pain, like I'd probably go down the route of trying to pull their foot slightly more towards the center of mass, so it's landing underneath their hips. Like the heel strike itself, it probably isn't as much of an issue. Like it's okay that people land on their heels, but where their foot strikes relative to their hips and their whole body while they're running is much more of an important concern for people that are getting knee problems. And so increasing cadence a little bit with something like a metronome, trying to do a small amount of barefoot conditioning, barefoot running, or running in minimalist shoes usually encourages people to land with their foot a little bit closer to their body. So those two things would usually solve that. There are, sorry to keep the rabbiting on.
Go. I like it.
Yeah, there are a few things that have consistently been shown in the science in terms of performance. So like if you look at sort of what the best runners do in terms of their technique, or the most economical runners do, there seems to be, I think it's like 3 things that they do consistently. And that's the center of mass doesn't seem to oscillate too much. So, when I say center of mass, if we kind of think about the belly button, I guess, somewhere around there, like that doesn't bounce up and down very much with runners that are very good, or runners that have got very good economy. So if you've got a runner that's flexing at the knee and the ankle quite a lot when their foot's in contact with the ground, and they're collapsing a lot through their legs, that's probably not a great thing for economy and performance. Whereas runners that stay a little bit stiffer and are able to run a little bit taller when their foot's in contact with the ground, that seems to be a little bit more advantageous. And then the other 2 are both related to overstriding. So again, the example I used before of a foot hitting the ground a long way in front of the body, that also doesn't seem to be great for economy and performance. And so landing with the foot with the foot, so the shins a little bit more closer to vertical, seems to be better for efficient and economical running. And equally, runners that toe off. So the last part, I'm sort of doing a demonstration here in
Now
my,
go for it.
my room. So runners that toe off in a position where their knee is completely extended, so in other words, their foot's a long way behind them, is also not great. So they're sort of producing force in quite a weak position behind them. Whereas runners that pull their foot off the ground and back underneath them a little bit quicker, where their knees in still remains in a slightly bent leg position, again seems to be more linked to economical and efficient running. So if runners can try to sort of hit those main three technical markers, that seems to be decent for economy. But I wouldn't mess around with it too much if they're healthy.
Well, I think you covered so many good angles there, and yeah, it's certainly an interest to me as more comes out. You mentioned obviously your research that you're working on at the moment of how strength training potentially might alter some of those characteristics, and equally
Yeah,
how it might not as well. I mean, I've got my own personal opinions, but um, without going on, my hunch would be is definitely you're going to impact what happens at the floor. So you've mentioned some of the things that happen at the floor, like the way the body will oscillate,
yeah,
whether it improves or changes not stride length, but overstriding. I'd like to think it would, but I think that area in terms of what happens just before the foot strikes the floor, that was maybe a little bit more contentious. But the one
yeah,
thing I'd be really interested in, I think you said about like sporting background. I think one of the things that makes great runners or really good runners, and I don't necessarily mean like Olympians, but even just like really good club runners, good is they probably have not bad general strength in the first place, and it's a
yeah,
characteristic that enables them to move well. So I think when research studies are just looking at really good people, that's okay for that population, but for most people, including myself, who aren't, like really really amazing, who naturally don't possess some of those great natural physical qualities, they're the real areas that are of interest, because as you said, they're the people that maybe might have massive heel strikes, massive overstrides, and maybe
yeah.
that's where strength training could have a benefit with those things. Whereas with some of the elite people, it might just have those more specific performance benefits that we already know. But who knows? I might be wrong. Hopefully, your research will tell us more.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think one thing related to that as well, and this is just purely me as a coach rather than as a scientist, is that one thing I'm quite a big advocate of with any type of runner is getting them to sprint quite regularly. And there's this, I guess there's three main reasons you might get a runner to sprint. So what I mean by sprint is like literally go flat out for no more than about 50 meters. So really short duration efforts where they're hitting top speed. And you might do that for a performance reason, with particularly with elite runners, because they've got to sprint at the end of races. Middle distance runners have obviously got to take off pretty fast. Like it's definitely a strength training stimulus because it's overloading the neuromuscular system in a very, very specific way. And it also might reduce the risk of injury because you're exposing muscles like the hamstrings, for example, to very different loading patterns than they do when they run. But what I often see, and I'm sure you see this as a lot as well, Dave. What I often see with runners that never sprint, or they come from a background where they haven't sprinted in any sport, is that they just don't have the capabilities to sprint, if that makes sense. It sounds odd, but when you watch particularly like recreational marathon runners do it just a completely flat out 50 meters, they try to adopt the same running mechanics as they do when they run a marathon, but they maybe just have a slightly faster leg turnover. And so they're still like heel striking, they're still bouncing up and down quite a lot. Um, their arm carriage doesn't really move very much at all. And they just don't really look like they're sprinting or trying very hard. But when you ask them to put in more effort, nothing really changes. And so I think with runners like that, you need to change their kind of sprint mechanics and just teach them to sprint properly in the first place so they can actually get the benefits from sprinting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean it's the ultimate plyometric, I suppose, isn't it? Because you said
Yeah,
it's as
exactly.
specific as it gets, isn't it? And yeah, no, like those kind of more less sciencey bits, but things that we commonly see, they're really important because just because they haven't been studied doesn't necessarily mean that they don't matter. And no, I could totally relate to the things that you've hit on. So if we kind of go into kind of some of the practical realms, one question I'd like to open up with, which again is quite a common one, is you've mentioned like plyometric training, heavy strength work, explosive strength work. strength training can encapsulate different methods, I suppose. How do you feel they can best improve performance? So, for example, do you favour one over the other? Do you think it's quite dependent on the level, or the athleticism that person has? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, am I allowed to say all of them are important or only?
Yeah. Divulge, say more. To say more.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the way that I tend to program, again, this is very much coaching based rather than science. Like my philosophy is very much around concurrent development of different qualities. So the way in which you categorized the strength training activities there is pretty much exactly how I would as well. So like heavy resistance training being like moving moderate to heavy loads through no more than about 8 repetitions, with fairly long recoveries between sets on things like back squats and deadlifts and step ups, like the different lunge patterns of movement. Explosive strength training being like light to moderate loads, but just trying to accelerate the load as fast as possible in quite a ballistic way. So in other words, leaving the ground while we do it. So things like jumping on a big box, throwing medicine balls around, doing squat jumps or jumps with dumbbells and things like that. And then plyometric training, as we've already spoken about. So doing jumps, hops, bounds, these sorts of things. So typically for the runners that I coach, they'll have all 3 of those in their program all year round. For a few reasons, really. Firstly, like runners tend not to need like huge dosages of each of those in order to get an adaptation in the first place. Whereas if you compare them to, like, I don't know, a rugby player, like the background you used to work in, Dave, like because they're very strength trained, like they need a really big volume of work or a big stimulus in order to drive explosive strength or maximal strength forward. Whereas runners aren't quite like that unless they've been doing it for like a whole decade. And so like small amounts of each of those types of work will often lead to quite meaningful improvements in the different areas. And I guess the second big reason is if you do just work on one at a time, other areas kind of regress quite quickly. So if I just have a big block of plyometric training and the athlete's jumping over hurdles and doing hops and bounds 3 times a week, they kind of lose a lot of the sort of basic strength that they've developed maybe earlier on in the winter. So I like to try and keep all 3 going at the same time. I guess it keeps it quite a bit more interesting as well and a bit more motivating for the athletes. But there's definitely a case of sort of dialing up and dialing down each of them, a bit like you sort of a bit like on a car stereo, when you can turn the volume up and you can turn uh, other dials down a little bit. So all 3 aren't at the same level all year round. It's a case of overloading some areas more than others and then dialing it back and increasing the volume in different areas.
Do you, again, if you were to compare using those training methods with, I don't know, maybe people like you've mentioned who you've maybe coached for a while, they might have a history of some type of strength training, or at least they've got maybe a decent block of strength training under their belt to some degree. Um, would you still use that same approach, or would that approach differ, say, for somebody who's listening now who hasn't got any strength training background or anything like that? What would your advice be to them on that front as almost a complete novice to strength and conditioning?
Yeah, so with the complete novice, I'd keep it fairly balanced between those different types. So some low intensity, low volume plyometric training to start off with, which might sit quite nicely at the start of a strength and conditioning session as a warm up or before an interval training session. Doing like 8 to 12 sets of heavy and explosive strength work, which I'd try and prioritize the sort of heavier stuff first, just with a small amount of explosive stuff. And as athletes become more experienced, so if they've been doing it for a few years, I would try and prioritize one a little bit more and just have a small amount of the other 2 going on in the background, again, maybe forming part of a warm up, and then shift the emphasis later on in the year. So one sort of dials down a little bit and the other one starts ramping up in terms of the prioritization and the volume. So all 3 are always present. It's just how much emphasis you're giving each. Like, have you got a fairly even spread across all 3, or are you ramping up some areas much more than others for different types of athletes.
Cool. Yeah, I like your analogy of the like the equalizer on the car stereo. That's a good way to
Yeah,
think
that was
about
the
it.
word I was looking for. Equalizer.
Okay. So again, that kind of segues quite nicely into kind of we call it programming. So essentially, like piecing together a strength training program. What again? You're not going to offend anyone, so it doesn't matter. But to really help people, sometimes you often kind of have to share some of the classic problems, the pitfalls that people can fall into. So,
Yeah.
from a strength training programming perspective, to improve running endurance, what maybe I don't know 2 or 3 classic errors that you think can typically occur that people want to avoid?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest ones that I often come across when I first meet runners, and I sit down and sort of chat about what non-running based training that they're involved with, it's often like a lot of, I'll sort of use inverted commas here, a lot of core stability, and a lot of kind of glute isolation type work. So they may be doing that 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a week, and they don't want to drop it from their program. They're sort of like, oh, yes, it's really important. I think the reason they like it, and again, not to offend anybody, but it's quite easy compared to like squatting with a heavy weight. And I think the reason that runners often like it is going back to something I said before, like you get a real burn with that type of work. It's like, oh yeah, I can really feel my abs have worked hard, or like my glutes are killing me at the end of that little glute circuit. But it's not a great stimulus for strength, and there's very, very little research to show that like kind of activating or overloading those sorts of muscles by themselves leads to any kind of improvement in performance or a reduction in injury risk. So I'm not saying that that type of training is redundant and runners shouldn't do it, but it doesn't make any sense to me why that forms the complete priority and sort of the whole S&C program. It can just be a small amount sort of going on in the background, I think. And then I think the other area, which, yeah, I've seen a little bit with resistance training, is that there's this sort of logical notion that because you're training for an endurance sport, then you need to follow kind of a muscular endurance rep and set type scheme with the way in which you complete the exercises. So very high repetitions per set, sort of 20, 25, 30. And obviously you can only move a very low load when you're up at those sorts of repetition ranges. But again, that's not really strength training. And so it goes back to what we were discussing before, that if we can understand why we're doing strength training in the first place, that we're trying to get this change in running economy because the neuromuscular system is one of the underpinning factors that influence running economy, then we need to load the neuromuscular system in an optimal way. And so if that ends up looking and feeling non-specific, so we're not doing exactly the same movement pattern as running, and we're not doing exactly the same sorts of repetitions as we do when we run, it doesn't matter because we're trying to develop a specific adaptation which is related to the neuromuscular system, which, as we say, underpins running economy.
Yeah, love those. Love those. We just yeah, great minds think alike. That's what I like to think anyway. But but I can empathise why, as you've said, with strength training and endurance, I can see why people do think that way because it kind of seems logical. It's a bit like how you think using a lighter weight and doing more reps is also less likely to make you put on muscle mass when actually the irony is it's probably the way
Yeah,
around, or that a
exactly.
heavier weight for less reps is going to make you sore and have less DOMs when actually it's like you mentioned. So but again, like if people like us aren't sharing this actual proper evidence, no one can get better and no one can learn. So flipping on then into kind of when people are doing strength training, what would you say again are 2 or 3 kind of classic errors that you might commonly see them make with any type of their kind of S&C training?
Um, I think, yeah, we've spoken about plyometric training quite a lot, but it's a stressful type of strength training activity if we're going to do it properly. And I think the runners that buy into that type of training and can see a benefit in it will just, similar to as I've spoken about before, they'll set up drills in a way that allows them to kind of feel the exercise. Like they want to feel load going through them. They want to feel the muscle stressed. Like if they can get a bit of fatigue in the muscle, then great. That sort of feels a bit more like running. But as a result, because of the high forces that are involved with that type of exercise, they end up with pretty awful and shoddy technique. And so the risk suddenly goes through the roof, that it's going to contribute to some sort of injury. Um, so yeah, you often see runners sort of jumping over hurdles without coaches, or they're doing hops and bounds because they've read in a magazine that it's really good, but there's nobody there watching them and coaching them how to do it. And they kind of exhibit this like really long ground contact time, like the technique in the air looks a bit messy, like their ankle and foot aren't quite getting in the right position. Their knee alignment, like relative to their ankle and their hip, is pretty poor. So they land in quite unhealthy knee positions, and their posture's just all a bit all over the place. But yeah, they think if they're doing the exercise, they must be getting some benefit. So just crack on, sort of thing. And then I think, yeah, secondly, from a weight stream perspective, you see the same sort of thing happening, that runners will sometimes load up on exercises and go through quite short ranges of movement, again with quite poor postures because they've perhaps not been coached on the exercises. So for me, it's just a case of just making sure that they start with the fundamentals and they can move fairly well under body weight, just with body weight first. So they can hip hinge effectively. They can squat through a fairly good range quite well. They can lunge and do different step up variations fairly well. And maybe a bit of push and pull for the upper body as well is quite important.
Yeah, great tips. And I mean, we'll touch base on your training journey in a moment. But actually, I remember this very house when I was about 14, trying to do alternate leg bounds in the garden and
Yeah.
injuring my ITB for the very reasons of what you just mentioned. So I've had to learn the hard way, and maybe it's part of the reason why I do what I do now. But I think what you said there as well is fascinating about how you've talked about the importance of strength training and getting load right. And often people think that means, right, 100 kilo deadlift and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But as you've mentioned there, is technically that you've got to load the right muscles. And that means getting the body in the right positions. You just mentioned about like body weight. And it brings, I mean, a lady who we work with who's a really good age group triathlete, a chronic injury background, just going through her assessment, just being able to do a split squat at body weight wasn't possible. Now, she could have probably put 30 kilos on it, but technically would have been loading the wrong muscles. So
Yeah.
exactly that type of scenario. And sometimes, again, that even as a coach, even to me, I'd step back and I was like, wow, this woman does some phenomenal things. But actually, you can see why injuries would happen because they haven't got the
Yeah.
ability to keep in those good positions. So
Yeah.
love those points. What would you say about your own training journey then? Tell us about you mentioned at the start kind of some of your own experiences in general, but tell us a little bit about kind of, I suppose, more of how you got into the endurance side of stuff, what you've done, what you've got wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I mentioned right at the start of the podcast. So I started out when I was a teenager. Like, I used to play football and tennis, I guess, like any teenage lad. Then I started going down to the local athletics club, loved it. Sort of specialised in middle distance running at about age 15, and did all right. Like, I was county champion. I think I won regional title a couple of times, competed at national champs. That's about as far as I got. I'd never, never competed internationally or anything like that. I was always super interested in sports science. Like, it sounds quite geeky in a way, but yeah, I can remember when I was doing like even GCSEs and A levels, sort of reading lots of different websites and magazines, just trying to find out about like the best ways to train, and are there any kind of ergogenic aids I can take to try and improve my running performance or whatever. And I think to some extent that was sort of my undoing, because exactly like you just mentioned, like I remember being in my back garden jumping over little homemade hurdles that I'd made myself, just because I'd read that was good for runners, and but nobody coached me, and I didn't know how much to do. I didn't know like how to progress it. And the only injury I ever had as a runner was an Achilles tendinopathy, and I just never shifted it over a period of about 5 years. Like, it was always just kind of niggling away in the background, and I missed a couple of track seasons as a result of that. And when I left university about age 21, I was doing a bit of just cross training on a rowing machine, and I got spotted by a rowing coach who said, the times you're doing on that rowing machine are really quick. Like, do you want to do you want to try out for this talent identification trial that Great Britain Rowing are organising? And I was like, I was injured at the time for running, so I was like, yeah, why not? So I went to that and then got picked up by GB Rowing and a talent identification program. So moved to Henley on Thames and spent 4 years rowing, and found out I was much more talented at rowing than I was at running, but I didn't enjoy it as much. So yeah, after 2008, I wasn't far off making the Olympics that cycle, but I was like, I'm not enjoying this sport enough. I need to get a proper job as well. So yeah, I stopped rowing in about 2007, 2008, but had a great 4 years doing rowing. Learned a whole bunch of stuff that I hadn't learned in running, just about endurance training and recovery and so on. So yeah, I guess that's a brief endurance training journey.
And kind of in the years since to now, in terms of strength bits and pieces and endurance bits and pieces, have you kind of is there anything that you've done or anything that you've maybe got on the horizon that you might consider doing?
Yeah, I still tick over with training. It's much more difficult these days, as I'm sure you experienced as well,
Oh
Dave.
yeah.
So yeah, I try and run a few times a week if I can, jump on the rowing machine. But yeah, I sort of go through periods where I'll have a bit of a goal. It sounds like very hypocritical of the way in
I
which
like it.
we tell athletes to train. But yeah, I'll go through periods where I'll have some sort of goal, work towards it for, I don't know, 3-6 months, have a go at it, and then I won't have a goal for about a year or so after that.
Hey, as I always say, you're only human, and I think the best people to always listen to are the people who are always willing to admit their own shortcomings and the
Yeah,
fact that they are
exactly.
human as well. So on that front, if you are training, random one, and don't be embarrassed, Rich. All right, top five. I mean, mine are horrendous. I won't tell you them yet, but top 5 training tunes. What would you have on if you could pick any 5 training tunes to listen to get the juices flowing?
This is a tough one, and it could potentially be a very embarrassing answer. This,
I
like,
like embarrassing.
I think at heart, I'm a dance and house music man.
Nice. Yeah.
Um, like, yeah, I haven't been to any gigs or clubs for a very long time now. But that would be my go-to if I was doing like a hard session on the road machine, like something a bit Tiesto,
Yeah.
like Swedish House Mafia type genre. Having said that, I've got like all sorts of stuff on my phone and iTunes library, and so generally when I train, I literally just hit shuffle and see what comes up, and it's anything from, yeah, like Tiesto to ABBA pops up, like
Oh yes, that's
some
my
sort
type
of
of music.
80s ballad, like a Phil Collins track or whatever.
Powerful.
People like walk in the gym and they're like, "Are you listening to Belinda Carlisle, Rich?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am, yeah."
Yeah,
So it's a
we
real
have
mix.
all sorts. We have all sorts blaring on out. Yeah, I actually did a poll not that long ago, just asking of is Elvis a good? Does anyone listen to Elvis when they train? And more people said yes than people said no. And I can't think of
Yeah,
anything worse. But clearly, I know nothing. And then on that front as well as a final one. Aside from sleep and nutrition, which is always the boring answer we say as
yeah.
coaches, what are 3 ways that you'd best recover aside from sleep and nutrition? Say you've done, some big runs, hard training sessions. What are 3 ways that you'd recover? Be specific.
Yeah, this is such a good area. It's such an important area, this to talk about, and yeah, I think my answer will be semi-serious here, just because it is so important. But I mean, one phrase that I learned when I was training with the Great Britain rowing squad was, they use this phrase "world-class training, world-class recovery." Or at least some of the coaches did, and it's mainly because they were like, we've paid tens of thousands of pounds for the best boats in the world. You've got the best rowing coaches in the world. You've got the best lake. You've got the best gym. You've got literally food, like all the stuff on tap that you could want. You've got beds to sleep in, the best food to recover, and whatever. But after all that, they still consistently used to see like Olympic level rowers making mistakes with their recovery. And what they meant by that was you'd see them bowling around the shops. You'd see them, they'd come to train, they'd be like, "Oh, I've been building furniture all afternoon," or "I've been out in the garden mowing my lawns." And And like, that's not world-class recovery. Like, world-class recovery is go home, lay on the sofa and watch TV, or sit in a chair and read a book, or ring up a family member or a mate that you've not spoken to for a long time and just chat to them on the phone for an hour and a half. And so it's sort of like a mental break, but importantly, you're getting your body to relax and recover. So I think, yeah, having just those are three examples, but just making sure that your recovery is high quality, and it's not just breaks between sessions. Like, in the breaks, you're actually recovering.
So what would your mental switch off be? Your mental recovery? You gave, like you said, about, you know, someone could lie down, put something on the telly. What would your go to be?
When I watch TV, it's comedy stuff that I pretty much the only stuff that I watch. So yeah, and anything that any sort of comedy on TV, particularly comedy quiz type shows.
What about Faulty Towers? Faulty Towers has been on a lot recently.
Yeah, I haven't watched that like that
Oh,
recently,
Rich.
but I would. Yeah, that 40 Towers is great. Like, I'm a massive fan of Friends. Like, it's
Oh no,
getting a
no
bit old.
way. Oh
It's
well,
getting a bit old now, but
that's the one thing we're going to have to differ opinion on. I
oh
can't
really?
relate to that. Yeah, but again, far more people enjoy it probably than don't. So I'm probably in the minority. So what do I know? But
Yeah,
no, yeah, I think the recovery one's such an interesting area because through the mission of many people who do endurance sports, recovery often really isn't recovery.
yeah,
It's a little bit of a contentious area because if people enjoy running, they can see recovery as going running again. But
yeah,
sometimes we've kind of said, you know, if you're a professional boxer and you're going to recover from boxing, you don't keep getting hit round the face. And
yeah, yeah. That's a good
not,
example.
yeah, it's not depriving people, but sometimes, like you've said, you know, you do need to give your body and your brain a proper rest. So I think that's a cracking one. So to finish off, Rich, in terms of yourself, anything you're up to, anything you want to share with people, how people could get in touch, whatever, what do you want to share?
Um, yeah. So, like, a lot of what I've already a lot of what I've spoken about on this podcast, I elaborate on a bit in a book that I published back in 2015 called Strength and Conditioning for Endurance Runners. I think it's fairly reasonably priced on Amazon, so people could grab that if they want to dive into the detail a little bit more. I did allude at one point to a book that I've recently edited, which is a bit more science heavy. If people want to get into some of the real topical and contemporary sports science issues related to middle and long distance running, that was published quite recently with Routledge. And yeah, I've mentioned a couple of times that we're running a few different studies at the moment, mainly with sort of moderately to well-trained runners. But if people are interested in just having the VO2 max measured, their running economy, their blood lactate profile, then if they get involved with any of the studies that are happening at Loughborough University and they can get there like a few times within the space of a month, let's say, then they can participate in some of the studies. So if people are interested in that, then definitely get in touch.
Yeah, I don't think you've lived until you've done some type of laboratory endurance tests, have you? We've had to do it by just being students in the past, haven't you? It's part of getting your
Yeah,
degree. You have to be a subject, but no, again, and you know, I've been up to Loughborough a number of occasions, and even though I never studied there, it would be a great place for anybody to go into those bits. And also, actually, my coaching colleague Craig Farndon as well is a big fan of that recent book that you just mentioned as well. So we can happily endorse that as well at the same time. But
thanks
Rich,
very much.
an absolute blast, mate. The things that we covered there on it, just absolute gold. Not just because it's really great information, but it's just information that people, particularly in the triathlon world, aren't hearing enough of. And to hear it come from trusted people like yourself, good blokes, is a huge thing. So I thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, again, thanks very much for the invitation to come on. Yeah, we covered some great ground there. So cheers.
What would you say about your own training journey then? Tell us about your, you mentioned at the start kind of some of your own experiences in general, but tell us a little bit about kind of, I suppose, more of how you got into the endurance side of stuff, what you've done, what you've got wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I mentioned right at the start of the podcast. So I started out when I was a teenager. Like, I used to play football and tennis, I guess, like any teenage lad. Then I started going down to the local athletics club, loved it. sort of specialised in middle distance running at about age 15, and did all right. Like I was county champion. I think I won regional title a couple of times. Competed at national champs. That's about as far as I got. I'd never, never competed internationally or anything like that. I was always super interested in sports science. Like, it sounds quite geeky in a way, but I can remember when I was doing like even GCSEs and A levels, sort of reading lots of different websites and magazines, just trying to find out about like the best ways to train, and are there any kind of ergogenic aids I can take to try and improve my running performance or whatever. And I think to some extent that was sort of my undoing, because exactly like you just mentioned, like I remember being in my back garden jumping over little homemade hurdles that I'd made myself, just because I'd read that was good for runners, but nobody coached me, and I didn't know how much to do. I didn't know like how to progress it. And the only injury I ever had as a runner was an Achilles tendinopathy, and I just never shifted it over a period of about 5 years. Like, it was always just kind of niggling away in the background, and I missed a couple of track seasons as a result of that. And when I left university about age 21, I was doing a bit of just cross training on a rowing machine, and I got spotted by a rowing coach who said, "The times you're doing on that rowing machine are really quick. Like, do you want to try out for this talent identification trial that Great Britain Rowing are organising?" And I was injured at the time for running, so I was like, yeah, why not? So I went to that, and then got picked up by GB Rowing and a talent identification program. So moved to Henley-on-Thames and spent 4 years rowing, and found out I was much more talented at rowing than I was at running, but I didn't enjoy it as much. So after 2008, I wasn't far off making the Olympics that cycle, but I was like, I'm not enjoying this sport enough. I need to get a proper job as well. So I stopped rowing in about 2007, 2008, but had a great 4 years doing rowing. Learned a whole bunch of stuff that I hadn't learned in running, just about endurance training and recovery and so on.
So hopefully you enjoyed, again, that snippet from Mr. Blagrove. Again, a top guy as well, a real gent. And as always, a little bit of summary from myself and Craig, just to help, I suppose, you digest that and come away with the key bits. So I think probably a couple of bits. I mean, I don't know if you want to start with one of the things that we speak about a lot about, people see plyometric training and they think, well, I'm going to go straight into that. But I don't know what your thoughts.
I think it's just the appreciation that strength training is a skill within itself. A bit like, definitely for myself, going back into the water and just really having to focus on every stroke and every fine detail of my swimming, just to try and get a little bit better at it. A bit like your strength training, just being really, really hot on your technique and your focus with it, really, is key, and having that intent. So when you pull through the water, really pulling down in your catch position is a bit like driving out the bottom of a squat with every bit of intent you've got.
I mean, we touched on it in the interview, but the amount of time, I think almost on a daily basis as a coach, me and Coach Craig, we were coaching very, very early this morning right through, and there definitely would have been a time where we were emphasising how if you're using said technique, you want to do it, not just from a safety perspective, but you're going to get so much more out of it for your gains, and your gains are obviously for your speed, your endurance, your efficiency, your economy, those huge things. So the technique isn't just there to be safe and look pretty, but again, it's I think like you said, if you think about it like swimming, with swimming you don't just think, right, I'm just going to throw my hands through the water and blast out my reps. It's always thinking about it from that perspective. It's quality, detailed thinking, but you need to obviously, like you've said, combine that with you can't just coast through your session. You've got to give it some aggression when you're coming out of the reps.
Point, like when you go to swimming pool, I don't just want to go in the water and swim lengths. I want to know there's 50 minutes of as been as worthwhile as they could be. Same with strength training, really. Time is of essence, and you want to get the most out of it.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll see more and more triathlete strength training on social media with tip-top technique. But obviously those techniques are totally dependent on the exercises that you're doing. And often, sometimes, the best way to describe them is somewhat dependent on what you're trying to achieve and who you actually are. People process information in different ways. But again, we use a number of cues which generally, particularly with the triathlete population, work very well. Whether that is enabling you to be able to use the muscles that stabilise your shoulders better through your shoulder blades when you're doing pulling exercises, to be able to recruit the muscles through your torso and your core, or even be able just to stabilise your knee better, all these kind of classic things. So yeah, you think you've hit the nail on the head with that one. I'm just learning with this podcasting. I don't know if I keep saying the same phrases again. I've always said about hitting the nail on the head numerous times.
I think that's the first time I've heard it today.
I hope so. Otherwise, that would be a bit embarrassing, wouldn't it? The other point, and actually, again, this is where our psychic skills, we will get better. I was trying to lead you in the direction of answering, but you didn't pick up on it.
Okay.
So clearly, my skills as a host are not quite like the levels of Letterman or Parkinson. But often when you see articles online on the internet, you'll see plyometric training, and by that what we mean is exercises where your muscles shorten and lengthen really quick. So it's usually skipping, hopping and jumping exercises. And it makes sense because there is really good science to show that type of training, when done right, does improve all the things that we speak about regarding the benefits of strength and conditioning. However, as I've alluded to with my own injuries in the past, if you do that training without having a foundation of strength training under your belt, the risk of you getting injured is very, very high. And actually, you're probably going to execute those plyometric exercises so poorly because you haven't got strength in the right places. You're probably not really going to get any benefit anyway. And we've seen this before in the past, haven't we?
Oh, we have, yeah. You know, as Dave said, you might have picked up on a magazine and everything, and it is, in essence, sometimes a missing trick to enhance performance. But generally, where you read it in these magazines, they don't emphasise enough how you do need that strength foundation. And I have seen it numerous times, and I don't want to call it a fad, but people like to jump on board with these things and think, oh, well, I'll do this, and without really understanding the context behind it. Well,
again, a good illustration of how it is done is, we never just do plyometric training within a triathlete's S&C program. It might be part of their program, but we never ever let the strength training itself stop, because overall that's going to limit your results. So again, just not only from a progression and getting better as a triathlete perspective with your S&C training, just from an injury perspective as well. Again, my injury, as I've spoke about and will speak about, that I've had in the past as a teenager, I'm a bit older now, that was driven off making this exact same mistake as well. So the plyometric stuff can look cool, it can look sexy, you can think, oh, that's what like the elite guys do. Yeah, but just remember the context. We're not trying to clip your wings.
I didn't mean to say that you can't appropriately begin some plyometric type work at a low level whilst doing your strength training if you're relatively new to strength training. I think it is important to emphasise that you can develop technique towards plyometric training alongside this, but there are some really advanced plyometric type activities out there which maybe shouldn't be done until you have got your teeth well and truly stuck into your strength work.
Yeah, and I mean, what examples might be things like a skip for height drills, so like big skipping drills, fast ankling drills with straight legs, like particularly what we call like cyclical jumping exercises, where you go from one rep into the other rep into the other rep. So like continuous like jumping squats, jumping lunges, jumping jacks. Like they're the ones you really want to look out for. So again, just a couple of bits again from Rich's great words, just hopefully kind of put into context a little bit. But essentially, the simple things done well with strength training are what delivers, and sometimes that isn't the stuff that seems to be the most sexy on the face of it. It's the stuff that we know scientifically and through experience makes a big difference. And at the moment, triathlon's still outside of the highest elite level at that point where that information hasn't come through, and that's where we're really passionate about getting that across and helping triathletes across the world be better with their training, smarter, and a lot more time efficient as well. We're all really busy. There was one thing that we wanted to touch upon to finish, which is completely off topic.
Yeah, so I obviously mentioned my top 5 training tunes. So what's yours, Dave?
Was it top 5?
Yeah, I believe so.
Right. And what type of training are we talking for here? Be specific.
Let's go, because it's what we do. Let's go strength training.
Let's go strength training. Okay. Well, there's got to be some hip hop in there. I'm a fan of my 90s hip hop. I've got a very diverse musical taste. That doesn't mean I think it's good. So I'd definitely say some Nas. I'd say anything off the album Illmatic. Yeah, any song off the album Illmatic would go down a treat. Then I'd say, what else would I do? I am a closet Status Quo fan. Anybody outside of Europe might not know who they are. They were a rock band from the 1960s. Apparently, they only had 5 chords that they played. I played the guitar and they didn't. But it's an acquired taste, nevertheless. So a bit of rocking all over the world, Down, Caroline. Oh, amazing stuff. What else would I have? Definitely, I like my dance music. So some classic trance music. One of my favourites would be something like Tony DeVee, The Dawn, like some proper fast, like trance from the late 90s, like you're in a nightclub at 1 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, we'll say no more about that. And then what else would I have? I might have something like really embarrassing on.
Yeah.
A bit of Take That, maybe.
What was that phrase?
Right. Yeah, anyone who's heard Right Said Fred on Too Sexy, that's... How did that happen, actually? What's the story?
I think the story goes along the lines of that it was when we'd, I believe we'd stepped up. I caught you at the top of the sink with pink marigolds on.
Yes.
And you happened to put Right Said Fred on, and I won't say the appropriate dance you were doing, but it was.
I also think though, didn't I once, because our music system at our training centre, we can control remotely from our phones, and I'm sure a few years ago Craig was coaching, I think it was Blake, and I don't know if it was, I think I was in my car somewhere else, and I knew you'd have the stereo system on full blast.
Right Said Fred, it was Susan Boyle.
It was Susan Boyle, sorry, there we go. I couldn't train to Susan Boyle. Anyway, I digress. One last song. So I've gone for a little bit I've got to go back to... maybe something off our motivational playlist, like some of the classic Rocky stuff.
John Farnham,
The Voice. Yeah, that is a good one. All our Australian fans will be applauding us now, hopefully. Yeah. So I think I've done that. So I think that shows a combination of, well, you could look at it 2 ways. You could look at that as a very educational, broad and eclectic choice of songs, or you could just say it's a ridiculous blend of appalling music. Either way, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So
it is indeed.
I think we've covered all bases for today anyway. So I'd just like to say to people, a big motivation for us to do this is for people to listen to it. It sounds a bit obvious. And all we ask is if you can comment, like, share, recommend, whatever it is to help this circulate and more people to listen. The more time we have to do this, the longer we'll do it for, and the more value that we can actually give people. So it would be an absolute pleasure if now or straight after listening, if you could share it, that would be awesome. Again, if you want to learn more about us and try Tenacious and how we use our strength and conditioning expertise to help triathletes, not just at our training facility in the West Midlands, but across the world as well online. Go to trytenacious.com, you can check that out. Just heard a few plates in the background because we are in the gym at the moment. So
coming up to coaching time now, isn't it?
Yeah, so we better shoot anyway. Yeah. Cheers guys, absolute pleasure. See you later.